which brush should you use for which shimmer. We're going to explore that today. I'm going to be showing you different brushes and other tools and how they apply different textures of shimmer shadows. And stay tuned for the end. I'm going to be showing you a special new applicator that really helps with flaky shadows. I'm going to be swatching the shadows on the back of my hand, and I will show you to compare some applications on the lid, but not all of them. Also keeping in mind that my hand does not have any sort of eyeshadow primer. It doesn't have a tacky primer, but I will also be showing you misting my brush after I pick up the shadow and how that applies, but I will just be using water. You can use a setting spray. I don't really find that any sort of setting spray does anything more than water does, and also I would be careful with using setting sprays because they tend to have alcohol in them, and that could cause irritation, especially that close to your eye. So I always like to just keep a little spray bottle with just some distilled clean water. So here are the different textures that I wanted to show you with the different brushes. So we have the squishy flaky, we have the dry flaky, larger particle size as well, and this is a dry semi flaky, so smaller flakes than these two, just maybe a little bit less than this one, and then a Piecey dry, a very smooth metallic. And for the squishy smooth, I'm going to be using this shade from the Rosy Jingle palette from Oden's Eye. So for application types, there are very many different kinds of brushes you can use, from synthetic to natural bristle to silicone tip applicators, sponge applicators, and then of course these all vary in size. I don't think the width and the height of the brush matter so much in terms of how it picks up and puts down eyeshadow. Really only matters about how much area you want to cover at once. And let's first talk about silicone tip applicators. These are so underrated and so handy. These are also great for applying loose pigments. These tend to be pretty stiff and they do come in different shapes and sizes. This one is from a set from Bella Beaute bar. This one is from the Sephora brand. I'm not sure if they have those anymore. And then this is a really old one from Huda Beauty, which is a dual tip with sponge tip applicator. Let's talk about the sponge tip applicator. I think that they're definitely useful in certain applications, but I think generally speaking, they used to be used with eyeshadows and they will be included in eyeshadow palettes, and they were definitely a very popular form of application of shimmers. They still hold their own, but it's really going to depend on your preference on what you want your shimmers to look like once they're on the lid, and also how easy they are to apply. Next, let's talk about natural hair bristles versus synthetic. So synthetic tends to be much smoother overall, while natural hair bristles are known to pick up pigment really easily, especially blending brushes as well. So there are pros and cons of each of those. Generally speaking, if you're using any sort of cream shadow, because they do soak up some of the liquid. So I'm holding up two brushes from Refer. So the difference between them is not only obviously in size, slightly varying, but really what we want to pay attention to is how the bristles are cut. So you can see that these are much flatter, and while they do kind of taper in and start cutting about here, I'll have that taper, they remain pretty flat, while the 28 brush has a little bit more floof to it. So it is still flat, but it has a little bit more flare at the top and just more substance there. So these will pick up, and of course same thing goes for the synthetic brushes. So this is a ColourPop brush, this is a Cinch EO1 brush, and this last brush is from Spectrum Collections, and it is in collaboration with KJH. It's the number 20 brush. So again, different shapes and different sizes, and both pretty flat, especially compared to blending brushes, noting that the Cinch brush has the most floof tapered bristles that probably start tapering about halfway in, which is what probably partially gives it that floof, while the ColourPop brush is still pretty flat but not quite as fluffy as the Cinch Beauty brush. And then the Spectrum brush is very flat. There's a little bit of taper all the way at the tip, making it really pointed. So these all will pick up different textures better than others. So first, I'm going to show you the Refer 21, which is very flat and natural bristles, and how it picks up a smooth formula. This type of brush is great for smoother formulas, and here is how it picks it up, and then here is how it applies it. And of course, using a spray of some sort will also help. You never want to spray the brush before you go into the pan, because then you're bringing whatever you're spraying it with, unless it's just water, into the formulation of the eyeshadow, which will affect the integrity. So here's another layer. I don't have any eyeshadow primer, and this time I picked up the shade and I misted my brush with just a little bit of water afterwards. And here is how it applies, much more foiled. Next up is the fluffier brush from Refer, the 28, and here is how it picks it up. picks it up really nicely. Generally, I would say I would recommend having more of these kinds of brushes that have a little bit more floof and tooth to them compared to the flatter brushes, but of course it's going to depend on what the majority of the textures of eyeshadow you have. So here's how that one applies. I'm just going to add another layer just like with the other brush, and then misted the brush after I picked it up. So these both work really great with this kind of texture. Next up, I picked it up with the silicone tip applicator. I'm going to try to leave room, which this one, I think the shape's just not really the greatest, but do you see how it really does help to pick it up? And it's already foiled, and this is dry pickup. However, my pan looks a little bit messy from trying to get this in there because it is so stiff. Next up is a Spectrum brush. Just gonna go and do the rest here. Misted the brush with some water. And I feel like it's actually not applying. It's a little bit harder. Obviously, you would not be covering this much area. This is just to demonstrate. And then the Cinch Beauty Synthetic Floofy Brush Dry. Just gonna add another layer. And misted. Next up, the Piecey texture. This one I definitely think applies best with a slightly fluffier brush. Now this is a pretty dry formula, so it's probably going to be very sheer. And it already is a sheer type of shadow, but definitely applies really nicely with a fluffier brush. With a flatter brush, not the best. It still works, but it just doesn't pick it up the same way. Really flat brush from Spectrum. This one does not want to like pick it up because it is so flat. It just doesn't have the tooth to kind of pick it up. And then the Cinch brush has lots of tooth to pick it up. And of course, misting it will help. And then lastly, the silicone tip applicator is going to work really, really nicely. If there's anything you take away from this video is make sure you have at least one silicone tip applicator, and maybe the other applicator that I'm going to talk about at the end. Next up is a Squishy Smooth. Definitely best applied with a silicone tip applicator. This is just usually really hard to pick up. Even with this, it's a little bit harder to pick up because it just kind of pushes itself away in the pan. And then a flat synthetic brush. Here's how that picked up. Not too bad, but definitely would need some helping. Picked it up and misted it with some water, and that helps for sure. For sure with this kind of flatter brush. Fluffy synthetic brush. This one's kind of a little bit of a hit or miss, but it does work. Misted it with some water. This one's definitely like a back and forth. You have to dip in between a bit. Flat natural hair bristle brush. Not too bad. Since it already picks it up, it puts it down pretty well. It's only going to be better with it misted. So then I'm just gonna show next the fluffier natural hair brush. Also pretty nice. And the reason I think the natural hair bristles do pick up the squishy formula better is because they do have that grip since they are natural hair bristles. Next up, moving on to the squishy and flaky formula. So here's the silicone tip applicator. Definitely picks it up pretty nicely. I do think that this shape of this one is not like the most ideal shape for eyeshadow application. So here's how it picked it up. It's a little bit kind of not fully even on the pickup. It is a little bit, but it does spread it really nicely. Flat synthetic brush, really not good at picking it up because it needs the tooth to pick up the flakes. Try to pick it up a little bit heavier, and I misted it afterwards. So better for sure, but still not ideal. And also this way it's easy to pick up too much and put down too much, and then it looks a bit textured on the lid. Synthetic fluffy brush. not really good at putting it down at all. Try to pick up a little bit more on the brush and I misted it with just some water. A little bit easier on the pickup, but I have to really work and add pressure to kind of smooth it out, which is not ideal. Probably not really something you want to be doing too much when it's on your eyelid, especially if you have sensitive lids. So those are all of them. Next up is the larger flake size with a silicone tip applicator. These are usually pretty messy, but this does pick it up pretty nicely. But there's definitely fallout and I have to kind of add pressure to try to smooth it out. It looks pretty patchy. Flat synthetic, almost nothing, pretty much nothing. Fluffy natural hair, just a little bit. Definitely think water's going to help, but before I do that, I'm gonna do all the rest of the dry swatches. So synthetic fluffy, not really, maybe a little too fluffy for that. So it just kind of moves around in the pan, but doesn't stick to the brush. Flat synthetic, pretty much nothing. And then here it is with a misted brush. Honestly, it really doesn't pick up. I try to make sure there was some on the bristles, but it does not really work that great. Flat synthetic, I'm not gonna do the rest of them because they're just not really working anyway. So yeah, it's a bit harder. It's just too dry in here. So when I go in with a brush in the pan, it just moves the flakes around. If you've been on my channel, you know that I prefer to apply shimmers with my finger between all the different textures. I find that it applies eyeshadow overall the most opaque. So if you don't want fully opaque, then definitely opt for a brush. But with these flakier shadows, not just the dry, but the squishy as well, what I like to do, and as I'm swiping up against the edge of the pan, so it already smooths it out. It makes it so much easier to use. And trust me, I don't like feeling product on my fingertips either, but I do have always a rag in front of me so I can just wipe my finger off afterwards and just look at how that applied compared to the rest of these. And especially if you use a tacky primer, this would be even more opaque. And the last type is the slightly flaky and dry, but not as flaky as the previous shade that I just showed you. So here it is with a silicone tip applicator. So here's how it picks up, a little bit chunky, but it is workable, especially with this. Flat natural bristle, not the greatest. Fluffy natural hair bristle, too much fluff. Flat synthetic, not the greatest. I'm gonna try another layer. Kind of helped a little bit. And then fluffy synthetic definitely picks it up pretty nicely, but because it has the dryness and the particle size, you will definitely get fallout with a fluffier brush between both natural hair and bristle. And then with my finger, you can do the same thing where you're just pushing it up against the edge of the pan. So it's definitely much smoother now. And there you have it. And I almost forgot to show you the sponge tip applicator. So here it is with the squishy smooth. Very nice. The non-squishy but smooth and metallic, really, really nice for sure. The Piecey, great too. The slightly more textured, really good. The large flaky, it's okay. I think the flakes are just too large, so they do just want to move around everywhere. And the squishy flaky has potential for sure. Would make sure you don't pick up too many large flakes and will need to be kind of rubbed with a little bit of pressure. So overall, the sponge tip applicator works the best across all of these. Now, I don't know if it will depend on the type of sponge. So this one obviously is the Huda Beauty one, which I don't think they sell this one anymore. So I don't know if the ones from the drugstore, just like the multi-pack, if it will apply the same way. Probably though. So the applicator I'm really excited to show you is this one. This is actually labeled as a lip like diffusing brush for lip products. And I saw this content creator, I'll put her Instagram up on the screen. I saw her applying a smooth shimmer shadow with it. And I was like, oh, that's really interesting. I really like the shape and the concept of that silicone applicator. However, once I got it, I actually realized it is not the same texture of a silicone tip applicator. So this has a lot more squish to it, and it almost has a little bit of tackiness to it because of the texture. So I can kind of feel it, like if I go like this, do you see how it's dragging? While it's very, very smooth, it just has like that kind of slight tackiness to it. So I was really intrigued, and I immediately was like, I need to try this with all the different shimmer shadows. So for comparison, here is the silicone tip applicator. Do you see how there's no give? And it's pretty smooth. It actually feels more rubbery than like silicone-y, while this one, I don't even know how to describe it to you. I can feel the tug on it much more, and I just thought that that would pick up shimmers really nicely. So I'm really happy that I ran into her video, and I got this little product because it's been a happy surprise. I got a pack of 2 from Amazon. I believe they were like $7. I did just see Carla Cosmetics came out with their own, and they said this to me in PR, but it's like the same thing. It feels exactly the same, but it's just gonna be probably like double the cost. I almost feel like this one mimics your finger essentially. So here's how it picks up the smooth non-sticky formula. The sticky smooth formula is going to be great. And this is really, really great application. The Piecey formula, I think maybe this one just a little bit less. I think it's going to depend on how you push it down in the pan in there. The slightly flakier dry formula. See, I can kind of smooth it out. It is pretty sheer though. But over a tacky primer, it would definitely be much more opaque. And then here's the dry flaky formula. Definitely picks it up the best out of all of them. But you do want to make sure you're kind of rubbing it and pressing it in. And then the squishy flaky formula, it picks up really nicely. Definitely want to make sure you're not picking up too much because I picked up way too much. But look at how easy. Look at how that makes it apply so nice. And it just really moves it and spreads it really nicely. So I put down the Matte Veil Primer from Ulta Beauty, and I'm just going to be showing you how this applicator applies a super flaky shadow. I mean, look at that. It picks it up really nicely, but you do want to make sure you're going in pretty light-handed. And I mean, look at that. It's as if almost I'm using my finger, because this is very similar to a fingertip application, except with the fingertip application, I would already have it smoothed before going on the lid, since I like to push it up against the edge of the pan. Now I do have a little bit of fallout, which is just really, really hard to avoid with any sort of textured shadow. Like this is the flaky shadow, this is it on the lid. And for reference, I'm gonna apply it with my finger. I did pick up probably a little bit too much, but you see how it's just... So essentially what seems to happen is the flakies kind of break up into smaller flakies. I'm going to add another layer. Definitely felt some fallout. But this makes application of the drier flakies so much easier. Again, primed with the Ulta Beauty Matte Veil Eyeshadow Primer, and I'm going to be applying the squishy flaky formula. And this one, I mean, if the dry flaky formula is easy to apply, this is going to be as well. Obviously a little bit of a messier application, but that looks pretty good. Now compared to a flat synthetic brush, definitely is going to take a little bit more elbow grease to disperse it. And I'm just trying to go in, kind of dipping back and forth, while the other one was one dip. And I feel like I'm definitely rubbing it in to help disperse the flakies. And you can see the opacity is definitely a lot more here, and it is more even. You could resolve that with using a tacky primer on this eye. Picked up some more and I misted my brush. And just going to go back in and add another layer, and that definitely helped a lot. And of course I do have fallout with both applications. It is a flaky textured shadow. So in conclusion, there are some brushes that apply certain textures a little bit better. For the smooth dry formula, I would say really any of the brushes. Probably wouldn't use either of the silicone tip applicators. And of course the sponge, I think, really picked up majority of them pretty nicely, keeping in mind that no matter if it's squishy or dry flaky formula, you're most likely going to experience some sort of fallout during application, but using a tacky primer, it will definitely help to stick it down initially. You just want to make sure you don't pick up too much, which sometimes can be a little bit hard as the brushes tend to pick up the flakes. For the emollient formula, whether that's the smooth or the flaky, definitely think this new applicator is a star and also applies dry flaky shadows really nicely with, of course, some fallout again. And of course, misting brushes with water and using a tacky primer will help the application, and generally the eyeshadow will just stick down to a wetter lid than a drier lid. But if you are looking for a more scattered or a less opaque application, that I recommend using the brushes without misting them and not using a tacky primer, which might not be an option if you have hooded oily lids. I hope this video was helpful. Let me know in the comments below what you think of it, and thank you so much for watching. I hope to see you next time.